The deed to the Aubert Opera House was still warm from the lawyer's hands when a single tone seemed to hum through the paper like a trapped bee. They said my great-aunt died quietly in the wings, but the stage never forgave a quiet exit. I told myself the tremor was nerves. Then the chandelier sighed, a breath of dust that smelled like old perfume and rain on velvet, and somewhere behind the red curtain, a woman finished a phrase no throat had sung for half a century. The sound wasn't loud. It was accurate, an arrow threading the empty seats, finding the soft place beneath my ribs where memory keeps its hand. I stepped onto the orchestra pit rail to listen. The note held bent and resolved, and the door to the conductor's box clicked open by itself. If you want to hear what I heard and why I stayed when I should have run, subscribe now. You won't want to miss the final note. I inherited the Aubert Opera House by accident, which is another way of saying secrets choose their heirs. My great-aunt Odette left me the keys in a box that smelled of oranges and mold, along with a photograph of her in a gown that looked like it had memorized the moon. I had never heard her sing. In every family story, she was merely the custodian, the woman who kept the ghost light on, and the taxes paid, while the town forgot the building it used to dress up for. The first night I walked in, the auditorium received me the way the sea receives a stone. Soundless, then suddenly endless. Plush seats climbed into darkness, their backs showing the oval wear of other shoulders. The ceiling mural, gods and swans and smoke, had cracked along a vein that ran straight through the central goddess's throat. Someone had patched it with gold leaf, a wound that wanted to be jewelry. I told myself I was there to make a plan, call an appraiser, list the property, let nostalgia do the rest. But the stage drew me like a flat horizon draws sailors. I crossed the pit and pressed my palm to the proscenium arch. The wood was warmer than it should have been, and in that warmth I felt a tremble, as if the building had a pulse. The ghost light, a single bulb on a metal stand, burned center stage. Aunt Odette must have left it. The bulb buzzed at a pitch I could name, just a hair sharp of A. I tightened the knurled collar, and the pitch settled. Habit, I guess. I used to tune my grandfather's old upright by ear, because the metronome in our house was always broken, and the digital tuner fell into the fish tank. Memory will make a technician even of the unwilling. Backstage, ropes hung like avenues of winter vines. The fly system creaked when there was no wind to blame. A length of gaff tape labeled Prima clung to the floor by the mark where a star would take her bow. Someone had traced a shoe print there, small and pointed, and written a date beside it in pencil, May 28th, 1975. That was 2 weeks before Odette stopped answering family letters. The conductor's box door stood ajar, exactly as it had in the lawyer's story about finding Odette's body, seated, shoes parallel, hands folded on a program as if she were waiting for the downbeat she had earned. I pushed the door with my elbow. The hinges protested with a violinist's cough. Inside, dust framed everything like snowfall in a slow film. The baton was still in its cup. A metronome, wood pyramid, sat still with its arm held at 60, as if heartbeat had been legislated. On the music stand lay a score I didn't know, La Ultima Aria, no composer's name. The paper looked expensive, veined and heavy. The first page had only one instruction, centered, "Sing what the house remembers." I laughed, because madness often begins as a reasonable chuckle. I set the ghost light aside, turned its bulb down to a faint pearl, and raised my hands as if the empty orchestra could see me. The room answered with a chilly hush that wasn't cold. I tapped the stand once. Somewhere high above, a curtain rope slipped. In its block, with the soft hiss of a throat preparing a vowel dot, that's when the first note threaded. The dark and my great-aunt's perfume, bergamot and violet, bloomed where no one stood. The note was not a memory. It was a location. It hovered somewhere above the stage left wing, where a copper draft curtain hung like a tired coin. I stepped toward it the way you'd approach a skittish animal, eyes soft, shoulders quiet. The pitch brightened as I neared, then dulled when I moved away, as if the house were tuning me to itself. "Aunt Odette," I said before I could stop the child in my mouth. My voice climbed the seats and disappeared into the gods. It came back thinner, as though someone up there had heard and decided to keep most of it. On the wall by the callboard, a list of cues was pinned under yellowed plastic. Scene changes, light fades, curtain calls. The last entry had been scribbled over, then written again in a different hand. Final song, only if audience remains. There was no signature, only a small sketch in the margin, a swallow with its beak sewn shut. I followed the corridor to the green room. Time had set up a mild tyranny there. Lipstick prints on porcelain cups, a faded newspaper with a review headline, Auber's soprano turns silence into color, and a velvet fainting couch that looked like it had recently remembered someone. The air was 10% breath, 90% waiting. I found a reel-to-reel recorder on a shelf, and beside it a plastic case labeled House Tone. My fingers chose play, the way a prayer chooses kneeling. The reel jerked, hissed, then opened like a door too long painted shut. At first there was ordinary auditorium noise, a cough, distant shoes, the insect tick of heat in ducts. Then the same note I'd heard earlier bloomed in the tape, perfectly matched, as clean as a tuning fork tapped on someone's bones. "Hold for her," a voice whispered on the tape, as if speaking across a hand. "Male patient, sure. Let the house show you the pitch. Don't force it. She'll find you." I pressed stop. The tape kept spinning. I had to pull the plug. Silence settled with the precision of a lid. When I lifted the plastic case, a Polaroid slid free. In it, the stage was bare except for the ghost light, and a woman turned away from the camera, facing the curtain. Her spine was straight and familiar in a way that made my stomach threaten mutiny. Odette, written on the border. But the date in the corner said 1978, 3 years after she vanished from our family table. Something tugged the hem of my coat. I looked down. A strand of silver thread lay coiled around my shoe, as if I had stepped into an invisible seamstress at work. The thread led into the corridor toward the trap room. I told myself it was a draft, and my coat had caught on a nail. I told myself many reasonable things. Then I followed. The trap room stairs were narrower than a promise. I counted them the way I count bad ideas, slowly, knowing I'd have to own each number. The thread glimmered as if lit from inside. At the bottom, the room opened into a forest of supports and mechanisms, the underribs of a beast that had learned to pretend it was a building. When I reached the center, the thread was gone. In its place was a circle of chalk. In its center, a score stand empty. And above me, as steady as a human hand on my head, a breath that was not mine. I stood in the chalk circle, because I have always obeyed frames. Picture frames, door frames, the frame of a question. Entering them feels like finishing half the work. The air here was warmer, thick as stage makeup. Above, I could hear the ghost light buzzing its steady vowel. I raised my hands again, ridiculous conductor with no orchestra, and waited to feel foolish. Instead, I felt calibrated. The breath, hers, the house's both, slowed to match mine. For a moment, I thought I could hear the exact shape of the auditorium, the way sound would pet the gilt balconies, run a finger along the murals, hide under seats like a cat, and then leap. I made a tiny downbeat, and the dark trembled as if it had agreed to something dangerous. Music began without instruments. It rose like vapor through floorboards, pooled at my ankles, then slipped between my ribs and opened a door that didn't exist and had always been there. I heard a motif, 5 notes, C, D, E, G, D, naive as childhood, then turned on its heel, minor and older. It was the kind of melody you can hum without ever having learned it. When the room repeated the phrase, I realized it wasn't echo. It was call and response with an unseen singer. "I can't sing," I whispered, honest as blood. "I only tune. You only remember," answered a voice that did not come from the tape machine and did not startle me because my bones knew it. Aunt Odette's voice had the texture of a velvet curtain seen from the audience, plush but frayed where hands have always pulled. "The house recorded me," she said. "Now you must record the house." "How?" "Stand where I stood and name what you hear." A rope slid somewhere, soft thunder. Dust fell in a small, affectionate avalanche. I described it aloud, and when I did, the five-note motif harmonized with my speech, as if the syllables were keys and the house had found the right ring. I felt foolish again, then lightheaded, then briefly certain this was exactly what the building had waited for. Not talent, not fame, just someone to tell the truth in pitch. I tested the air with my hand and felt a seam, a place where warmth stitched into cold like two fabrics arguing. When my fingers crossed it, the motif tightened, speeding to the rate of a human panic. I stepped back and it softened. I'd found an edge, not of a room, but of a memory. A shadow moved behind a scrim I didn't see until it breathed. A figure, feminine, long hair pinned, stepped toward the trap room mouth and paused at the stair. I saw her only as an absence, arranged into a woman, like smoke deciding to take responsibility. I didn't call her name. Names felt like knives in that moment. "Final song," she said, though lips did not move, and I felt the capital letters in my mouth like a dry coin. "Only if the audience remains." "I'm the audience," I answered, breath too loud. "I remain." The figure nodded once as if checking a box. Then she lifted an invisible score and inhaled. The house inhaled with her. The chalk circle brightened. No, it remembered brightness. And somewhere above us, a door I hadn't found yet unlocked, with the friendliness of a promise about to be broken. I found the unlocking when I came up from the trap room with chalk on my shoes like moonlight. A sliver of brightness leaked from a door high on the third balcony, an access I hadn't noticed on my first walk, tucked between a statue of a muse with a chipped lyre and a panel where gilt had been re-gilded badly by a later hand. The key from Odette's box fit there, as if keys are chosen by doors, not by people. The room beyond was shallow and long, full of maps. Not town maps, acoustic maps, drawn with lines like isobars, contouring the currents of sound that once lived in the house. Each sheet had notes in pencil: warm pocket here, tenor bloom dies against column, danger of swallow at bar 56. My great-aunt's handwriting, with its decisive downstrokes, marched across margins. In the far corner sat a second metronome, twin to the one in the conductor's box, its arm resting at 60. Between them, on a low table, a ledger weighted with its ribbon bookmark like a vein. I didn't open it. Not yet. Standing there felt like eavesdropping on air. I traced a finger along one map's curve and felt a warmth rise from the paper as if my touch completed a circuit. The five-note motif from below crept into the room and became something else, complex and vertical, as if the house, now that it had me alone, wanted to show me its higher mathematics. That's when the projector coughed. I hadn't noticed it. A battered 16mm unit aimed at a small screen tacked to the opposite wall. The switch was already on. The bulb flared to life with a son's bad memory, and the reel unspooled with a politeness that made my skin remember being a child called by both names. On the film, the stage appeared, ghostlight bright as a moon caught in a snare. Dancers without faces marked a sequence. No, not faceless, but blurred by a choice of focus that kept choosing the empty center where the prima should stand. A figure paced in the wings, hand to her throat. Odette. Even in grain her posture had grammar. She looked toward the camera, and for a second I believed she saw me. The soundtrack was not silence. It was the auditorium on a day without people, a held breath augmented by whatever instrument grief is. The five-note motif tried to emerge from that static and failed, again and again, as if someone behind the lens refused to let it finish. A pencil scratched on film stock between frames, only if audience remains. Over and over, a compulsion or a law, the image jumped. The ghost light went out. On screen, the house darkened into a version of itself I had never been in, but knew. The way you know the shape your mouth makes when you say your own name in a mirror you avoid. The last frame froze. The curtain seam, a line faint as a wrinkle in a throat. I reached for the projector to stop the reel before it slapped itself free. From the auditorium proper, far below, a chair folded as neatly as prayer hands. Someone had taken a seat, just one, And then, as my fingers touched the projector's switch, a second set of hands, human weight cool as coin, closed around mine and held them there. The hands that closed over mine were colder than any draft I had felt in that house. They didn't squeeze, they steadied. For a moment, the projector beam wavered across the wall like a lighthouse caught between duties. When I turned, no one was there, yet my wrist still wore the impression of being held. The film ended with a sharp slap, the reel freewheeling until I caught it. Silence crowded the room, like a congregation holding its breath. I whispered, "Odette," as though naming her could stitch a person back together. Nothing answered except the light hum of the ghost bulb below, steady as a pulse. The ledger on the table tempted me, a black book with its ribbon tongue daring me to open. When I lifted the cover, the spine cracked like an old joint. Inside were pages of neat staves, each line blank but annotated in the margin with dates. 1973, 1974, 1975, 1978. After that, empty. A score waiting for someone to write in it. The margins carried a single recurring phrase, sometimes in French, sometimes in English. Audience remains. I wanted to leave. Every nerve begged for daylight, for the ordinary racket of traffic. But something had shifted. The building was no longer content to be ruins. It wanted to be heard, and it had chosen me as its throat. I tucked the ledger under my arm and shut off the projector, promising myself I would never turn it on again. On the balcony rail, a single playbill fluttered. It hadn't been there before. The paper smelled of fresh ink, though the date said opening night, May 28, 1975. My aunt's name headlined the cast list, Odette Lemaire, soprano. Beneath her name, someone had scrawled in pencil, "Final song, unfinished." As I stared at it, the auditorium below changed. The ghost light dimmed until the stage looked less like wood and more like an aperture. In the audience, 3 more seats folded shut, one after the other in patient succession. Whoever had come was not alone anymore. I gripped the ledger tighter. And that's when a voice, unmistakably Odette's, sang one syllable from the stage, just one. But it was enough to fill every seat with listening. The syllable hung in the rafters, long after silence should have claimed it. I staggered down the stairwell, the ledger knocking against my ribs like a second heart. When I emerged into the auditorium, the stage was empty, yet the sound still coiled around the curtains, a perfume of resonance refusing to evaporate. I climbed the stage steps. The boards creaked like vertebrae aligning under weight. Center stage, the ghost light stood in its circle. I could swear the bulb pulsed in time with my breathing. I set the ledger on the floorboards and opened to a blank stave. The note I had just heard, pure, unwavering, etched itself faintly across the page in graphite no hand had touched. "This isn't memory," I whispered. "It's transcription." The auditorium responded with a sigh of velvet, as if dozens of skirts had adjusted themselves at once. My pulse sprinted. I was no longer the only body here. A movement in the wings caught my eye, a shadow rehearsing a gesture, the tilt of a chin, the lift of arms as though invisible music had just cued it. I forced myself closer. Dust motes whirled like confetti, revealing the outline of a woman in rehearsal gown, her back to me, hair pinned with combs that glittered in light that didn't exist. "Odette," I said. The figure stilled. Then slowly she turned. Her face was blurred, not absent but smudged, as though film stock had melted under heat. When she spoke, the voice was both hers and not hers. You must listen to what I could not finish. The ghost light buzzed louder, a harmony in itself. My throat was dry, but I managed the final song. Her blurred head inclined. "Only if you remain." Seats groaned again in the auditorium, one after another, 100 silent spectators settling. My chest tightened. The house was filling, but not with the living. The figure stepped backward into the curtain, dissolving into fabric. The stage ropes above swayed as though stirred by applause. The ledger at my feet filled with more marks, graphite scratches forming measures that begged to be played. A draft touched my ear, intimate as breath. "Don't conduct." Don't sing. Witness. The curtains shivered, then parted by themselves, and the stage revealed not emptiness, but an orchestra, faceless, instruments raised, waiting for my downbeat. I froze. My hands hovered, ridiculous conductor over an orchestra stitched from shadow. Bows poised above strings, mouths closed on reed and brass. They waited. 100 faceless players in uniforms that looked pressed yesterday. The silence had its own gravity. I wanted to run. Instead, I lifted one hand. Instantly, the downbeat landed. The sound that erupted was not performance. It was architecture remembering itself. Chords rolled through the house, so physical the seats rattled, the chandeliers rang. The score in the ledger wrote itself with frantic accuracy, every note burning into graphite. I realized the opera house wasn't only haunted, it was still composing. My aunt's absence was less a death than a comma, but the music wasn't perfect. Something warped in the measures, a tremor as though one chair played against the others. I scanned the faceless orchestra. There in the back, a cellist, bow soaring against silence, no sound coming out. A wrongness too deliberate to be mistake. As I focused, the cellist lifted its faceless head toward me. My stomach turned ice. In the void where a face should be, I saw rows of seats collapsing inward, mouths wide as graves. The cello screamed, not musically but like metal tearing. The orchestra faltered. Notes fractured. The motif of 5, C, D, E, G, D, returned, twisted, like a child's tune played underwater. I shouted, "Stop!" But the house ignored me. The faceless players surged louder, drowning themselves in their own echoes. The ghost light flared, a sun in miniature. The blurred figure of Odette appeared stage right, hands clasped in anguish. She mouthed something, but no sound came. I stepped forward. The ledger at my feet erupted in graphite fury. Notes scratched so hard they tore the page. My pulse drowned thought. I reached for Odette's phantom, and she reached back. Our hands never met. Instead, cold passed through me like a wave. My knees buckled. The orchestra collapsed into silence so abrupt it rang. When I opened my eyes, the seats were empty again. But the stage bore one new object, a single chair, spotlighted, waiting for me. The chair was velvet, worn, the kind that remembers everybody. Its placement center stage was invitation and command. I hesitated. Behind me, the ledger pages still fluttered, though no air moved. Each blank staff now carried notes, hundreds of measures in a hand that wasn't mine. I sat. The instant my weight touched it, the house changed. Lights bloomed across the balcony tiers, chandeliers trembling alive. The auditorium appeared fully occupied, shadows in evening dress, masks of blur and absence, but present all the same. A full audience, silent, leaning forward. I gripped the armrests. The blurred figure of Odette materialized in the opposite wing. This time her features were clearer, cheekbones, lips, eyes rimmed in desperation. She looked younger than in her photograph, like the opera house had kept her at the age she last performed. She raised her hands. The orchestra reappeared behind her, faceless again, instruments poised. A conductor's baton lay across my lap, cold as if it had waited decades. Odette's gaze locked with mine. She shook her head once. "Not you. Witness, not conductor." The first measure began without me. Strings swelled, winds layered, percussion like heartbeat. The melody that had haunted me returned. 5 notes stretched into something vast, tragic, unfinished. Odette stepped to center stage. Her mouth opened. The voice that left her was not ghostly, it was absolute. Sound filled the rafters, clean as sunlight and lethal as confession. Every chandelier quaked. Cracks spidered across the painted ceiling goddess's throat, golden leaf peeling away. The sound grew unbearable, forcing tears from my eyes. Yet it was beautiful, more truth than I had ever endured. Then she faltered. The final note broke. Her eyes locked on me, pleading. The orchestra dissolved mid-phrase, instruments dropping into silence like stones. The audience shadows hissed, a chorus of disappointment. I clutched the baton, tempted to rise, to give the downbeat she begged for, but when I moved, the chair held me fast. The arms gripped like iron. I was prisoner to the witness role. Odette gasped, then screamed a single word across the house. "Remain!" The chandeliers dropped all at once. I didn't die. I expected impact, crystal, wood, bone, a brief census of breaking. But the chandeliers froze a hand's breadth above the audience, their prisms trembling like startled birds. One loose pendant grazed my hair and left the smell of hot dust and lightning behind my ear. The audience's hiss compressed into a single intake. A gasp held at the edge of time. Odette stood center stage, bent over, palms on her knees, as if the note had run through her like a spear and left her hollowed but upright. She lifted her head. Her eyes were clear. In them I saw not a plea this time, but a question. "Will you stay?" "I remain," I said, voice small in the cathedral of it. The frozen chandeliers lifted back to their chains with insect patience, as if the house had reconsidered murder. The orchestra did not return. The seats were occupied by silence that had learned to sit still like a person. The ledger beside my chair had flipped pages by itself. New measures inked the paper in a hand I felt in my wrist bones, Odette's, but the staves thinned toward the bottom as if starving of ink. At the very end, a margin note, not breath, audience. Below that, another shakier script, and if they leave. A drag of air answered, "They don't." It wasn't a voice, not quite, but the notion of one, threaded through the curtains. I realized what "only if the audience remains" meant. Not applause, not ticket holders. It meant witnesses who accept the cost of hearing. The final song demanded an audience that would not flee the truth it delivered. If they ran, the opera house kept them as placeholders until someone stayed. I looked out over the blurred faces. Were they deserters or loyalists who could not complete the vow? My scalp prickled. I stood from the chair. It released me now like a parent deciding to let the child cross the street alone. "Show me," I said. "What failed?" The stage dimmed, except for a path of light that led to the conductor's box. I followed, shoes whispering across boards polished by a century of catastrophe. Inside the box, the metronome's arm rose of its own accord to 60 and began to click. Not time, but pulse. Odette's, mine, the house's. I set the ledger on the stand. The first 5 notes wrote themselves again, C, D, E, G, D, and then stuck, wobbling on the last D like a moth caught in a lamp's chimney. Behind the stand, a panel in the wainscoting stood a hair open. Added always? I slid my fingers along the seam and felt a catch. The panel yielded to pressure with the embarrassed squeal of a secret discovered too late. Inside, a narrow cavity. Inside the cavity, a sealed envelope, the wax stamped with the same crest as the deed. I broke it. The letter was from Odette. "If you read this, the house has chosen you as it chose me." I did not fail for lack of voice. I failed for lack of witnesses who would let the last note land where it hurts. I could not make them remain, and the house would not let me sing to nobody. Find the true audience, then sing what the house remembers. A postscript in smaller hand, shaky. "There is one more thing beneath the stage. Do not go alone." A draft touched the back of my neck like a warning. The trap room door creaked open, uninvited. I went anyway. The trap room swallowed me a step at a time, each riser a rung into someone else's memory. I brought the ledger like a relic and a utility. The ghost light above cast a long, obedient ray down the stairwell, thinner with each turn, as if the bulb were unspooling its last courage. The understage smelled of cold rope and old water. Pipes ran like ribs, sweating. The chalk circle I had stood in earlier was faint now, the scuff of my shoes erasing it into doubt. In the far corner, a door I hadn't noticed before was half hidden by flats and broken set pieces, a castle window, a cardboard forest, a moon in 2 halves. The door had no handle, only a narrow slot where a key might once have lived. Something clicked. Then another. A scatter of ticks like rain began in the dark, irregular at first, then resolving into a single, stubborn tempo. 60, metronomes many. A rude choir of wooden triangles insisting on the law of pulse. "Odette?" I said, because there was no one else to say. The ticks answered by aligning, downbeats landing together like boot heels on parade. The ledger warmed in my hands. Notes ghosted onto the page without ink, heat burnished like secrets on lemon-juiced paper. I found the metronomes on a shelf against the far wall, 6 of them, all twins to the pair upstairs. They had no visible wind, no pendulums that my physics could accuse, and yet their arms swung with polite tyranny. Behind them, nailed to the wall, a schematic of the house's fly system, annotated in Odette's hand, counterweight memory. Trap breath. A smaller note, cello seat unstable, do not trust. I thought of the faceless cellist's scream, and felt my stomach gather itself into a fist. At the base of the wall, under the schematic, was a low drawer with a brass label, Audience Log. I pulled it. Inside cards, each with a date and account. May 28th, 1975, full. June 4th, 1975, half. July 12th, 1975, scattered. The later cards were few. The last one, November 2nd, 1978, 1. The number had been underlined twice, then carved through. A smear, dark as the inside of a plum, stained the edge. Ink, I told myself. But smell is a better historian. It smelled like iron. Not alone, the letter had said. I looked over my shoulder. No one. Yet warmth pressed between my shoulder blades like a presence leaning in to eavesdrop with me. If you're here, I said, voice too loud, help me open that door. The door in the corner remained a refusal. I set the ledger on a crate and pressed my ear to the wood. Behind it, the sound of water, slow and deep, the cistern under the city that the opera house tapped for cooling in summers when people dressed heat into ritual. Over the water, a sound like humming. Not human, architectural. The metronomes tipped their arms forward together and held there, as if offering me a second to decide. Then they released with a click that sounded like a lock. The door eased inward on a cushion of air. Beyond, a narrow bridge of grating stretched over black water. At the far end, a platform with a music stand and a lamp. The lamp was lit, no cable fed it. My hands trembled so hard, the ledger's pages rattled like leaves in a stage forest. I stepped onto the grating. It flexed, just enough to make me think of falling. Water licked at the iron with a cat's certainty that it would one day own it. The humming grew clearer. Harmonics nested in harmonics, the house tuning itself to a note I could almost name, and dared not. Halfway across, something knocked the grating from underneath. I ran. I didn't fall. The knock came again, focused, deliberate, the way a hand might tap a shoulder to say, "Stop ignoring me." I turned, breath hanging like a flag in bad weather. Below the bridge, water lapped blackly around pillars that descended into mystery. For a heartbeat, light softened along a shape, moving just under the surface. Then gone, the platform arrived under my feet with the relief of floor after fever. The music stand's lamp burned with steady flame that seemed to recognize me. On the stand lay a small score bound in leather, its title stamped in a modest, unbragging font, La Ultima Aria. I'd seen that name upstairs. This copy was different. It felt heavier, as if truth had weight. Inside, the first pages were blank staves like the ledgers. Farther in, notes appeared, Odette's hand, I was sure, meticulous, breath-marked, full of crescendi that felt like weather systems gathering. Then a sudden desert. 4 bars left empty, followed by a single staff with a line through measure and a note in the margin. Never in rehearsal. Only with witnesses. At the very end, a rectangle of paper had been carefully cut out. A theft shaped like a bar of music. You didn't fail, I said aloud, as if my voice could walk a word across the water back to 1978. You were robbed. Not robbed, said a voice behind me. Burdened, I turned. A man stood at the near end of the bridge, where the door opened to the trap room's shadow. He wore an old suit that fit like a memory, its cuffs polished with wear. I recognized his posture from the reel, the patient figure in the wings who had said, "Hold for her." His face was not blurred. He looked utterly ordinary, which in such a place is an extravagance. "You recorded the house," I said. "I tried," he answered, voice gentle as a bass note. "But I was only the ear. Odette was the throat." "In the house," he let the sentence hang, listening. "The house is the lung." He stepped onto the grating. It did not protest. "I hid the last bar," he said, "because when she sang it without enough witnesses, the house took them. It mistook cowardice for absence and absence for death. I couldn't risk another trial. I thought if I cut the end, the house couldn't finish the sentence that kills. And yet, I said, they remain. I gestured up to the auditorium and its blurred loyalists. You saved nobody. He flinched as if I had thrown the word. I saved her from becoming part of the building. He nodded at the black water. That's where the house keeps what it loves too much to let go. The surface dimpled, as if a breath rose from below. He pointed to the empty bars. You must supply the last measure. Not with ink, with breath. But not yours alone, he met my eyes. You asked, will you stay? The answer is, not alone. Metal groaned somewhere in the distance, deep and architectural, the sound buildings make when they confess. He looked back toward the door, then down at the water. It's listening, he said. Then the grating under his feet bucked like a horse, and he vanished into the black. I reached the edge too late. The water closed over him with the implacable neatness of a stage direction. I leaned on my belly, arm plunged to the shoulder, fingers tearing at nothing. Ripples wrote their unreadable message against my skin and dispersed. There was no splash, no thrashing, only absence, which in this house had every right to call itself presence. I lay on the grate, breath shuddering, and listened. The humming shifted, grew curious, then sympathetic, then expectant, like a roomful of people leaning in. The lamp on the stand didn't flicker. It was as steady as pulse. The last bar, I said to nobody that was not nothing. You want it. You've wanted it for 50 years. The ledger on the stand warmed again. My hands turned a page. New staves gleamed like bone. I set the ledger beside La Ultima Aria and felt the arithmetic of both click into place. The house didn't need a composer. It needed a translator who would refuse to run at the end. I can't sing, I said. And my voice sounded tired of repeating the truth to a place that didn't care. Then tune, Odette answered. And the syllables seemed to walk toward me along the grating from the dark. Tune me, tune them. Them. I looked upward, through the trap room's mouth, past the stage boards to where audience waited in their blur. The witnesses, she said. They left before the last note, because nobody asked them to hold. Ask them. Make them remain not by force but by invitation. The note lands where it hurts, and the hurt is where they live. They will stay if you promise to hear them too. Air moved across the water like the memory of a hand. I stood shakily. How? Begin with the house tone, she said. Then name what you hear. All of it. I placed my palm flat on the stand the way I had on the proscenium. Heat rose through wood. I matched the pitch of the hum with my throat, untrained, embarrassed, and found to my shock that the house obliged. The tone stabilized, richened, like a cello gathering its dignity after insult. The metronomes resumed their consensus at 60. Above, chair legs creaked as the audience leaned forward. I spoke into the hum. I hear fear. The tone took it, altered it, made a lower third. I hear love held back until it sours. A fifth added itself. I hear a woman who kept the ghost light on so others wouldn't walk into edges. The chord broadened until the air tasted metallic. I hear absence practicing being presence until it can trap you with courtesy. The grating under my feet thrummed. The water below rose a fraction, not flooding, listening. The blank bars in the score whispered graphite onto themselves, marks not notes but vowels. What else? Odette asked. I hear you, I said, and for the first time since I arrived, I felt how lonely she had been under applause she could not risk. I hear you asking me to stay. Will you? I remain, I said. Above, hundreds of feet settled at once, final, like a verdict. The hum climbed, a ladder into the rafters. I matched it, voice thin but serviceable, a wire to carry current. The last bar in the score flushed with heat, then printed itself in ink so black it drank the lamp. Something moved in the water beneath the bridge, slow, enormous, and brushed the iron from below with the care of a parent waking a child. And then, from the stage above, the faceless cellist began to play again. The cellists bowed, dragged across invisible strings, producing a sound not meant for wood and horsehair. It was raw, like a scream rehearsed into elegance. The water beneath the grate vibrated in sympathy, black waves climbing higher, slapping against the iron. I steadied myself, ledger clutched like scripture. Not alone, Odette had warned. And yet here I was, listening to an orchestra of one, a faceless figure clawing sound from silence. I raised my voice above the noise. I hear you. The words felt absurd but necessary. I hear the seat that betrayed you, the silence that ate your measure. The ledger responded, graphite sketching a counter-melody against the scream. The notes calmed, transformed the raw shriek into something mournful, then almost tender. The cellist stilled, bow raised, head tilted, the faceless void fixed on me, as if considering whether I deserved rehearsal space in this grave of sound. Then slowly it lowered its bow. The water subsided a little, whispering, unsatisfied but patient. Above, the audience stirred. Chairs snapped upright, as though hundreds of people had risen at once. A pressure fell on my shoulders. They were standing, waiting. The faceless cellist turned, walked toward the shadows beyond the bridge, and dissolved like paper ash. In its place, the hum returned, steady, pulsing, a room demanding its last bar. I looked at the blank measure in the score. Still waiting. Always waiting, I whispered. I can't finish you alone. And somewhere above, in the wings, Odette's blurred silhouette nodded. The metronomes clicked in unison, a beat of invitation. It was time to return to the stage. When I climbed from the trap room, chalk dusting my knees like confession, the stage had changed. The ghost light was gone. Instead, hundreds of footlights blazed, brighter than electricity should allow. They cast the house in sepia, like a photograph refusing to age. Odette stood downstage, fully visible now. No blur, no smudge, just a woman with grief in her eyes and a voice coiled in her throat. She looked younger than me. Perhaps she always would, bound to the year her song stalled. The ledger lay on the floorboards, open to the final bar. She gestured toward it. Together, I stepped beside her. For a moment we stood like conspirators before a crime. Then the audience shadows settled, patient and unblinking. The orchestra seats were empty, but I could feel instruments humming in the wings, waiting to be called. Ask them, Odette said. I turned to the blur of faces. My knees shook, but my voice found clarity. Remain, not because you must. Because endings are owed witnesses. If you leave now, the house keeps you. If you stay, the song ends, and so does your waiting. Silence stretched taut. Then one by one, the chairs folded again, not vanishing but settling, each shadow lowering itself deliberately. They stayed. The score brightened, the last bar pulsing like a heartbeat. Odette lifted her chin. The orchestra returned, faceless but ready. She looked at me once more, gratitude thick as grief, and began. The final song rose. The sound was unbearable and beautiful at once. It threaded my ribs, found every scar I'd forgotten, and plucked them like strings. Odette's voice carried not only melody but memory, the weight of performances aborted, of notes unsung, of applause withheld. The house itself joined in, rafters groaning like cellos, air ducts sighing like flutes. It was not music. It was history finishing itself. The audience leaned forward as one body. I could feel their hunger. But it wasn't applause they wanted. It was closure. The blur began to sharpen, outlines of faces resolving into half-memory. An old man wiping his glasses, a young girl with her chin on the seat back, a critic scribbling until the pen tore paper. Witnesses restored. The final song climbed toward the last measure. My skin prickled with dread. This was the place Odette had never reached, the bar cut from the score. She turned to me mid-phrase, eyes commanding, as though I were the baton she'd never been granted. I opened the ledger. The bar glowed blank, but I heard the house humming the missing note, low, inevitable. It was waiting for me. I spoke into the sound. I remain. The ledger inked itself black, the missing notes appearing as if written by breath. The orchestra swelled to meet them. Odette inhaled for the final phrase. The chandeliers trembled. The murals cracked wider. The house held itself like a lung at full capacity. She sang the last note, and every light in the auditorium exploded. Darkness fell, absolute. I expected silence, but the note continued, vibrating through bones and brick. It was no longer Odette's alone. It belonged to the house, the audience, even to me. For a terrible second I thought it might never end, that we had unleashed an eternal cord binding us forever. Then, gently, it resolved. The vibrations stilled. One by one, lights relit, not shattered but restored, brighter and younger, as if 50 years had peeled away. The murals gleamed fresh. The seats were full of people, no longer blurred, every face clear. They applauded, thunderous, deafening, real. I turned to Odette. She was radiant, tears streaking a smile. "They remained," she whispered, before her body dissolved into light. The applause swelled, then dimmed, fading into nothing but the soft buzz of an ordinary bulb. The audience was gone. The seats were empty. The house was silent. I stood alone on the stage, the ledger closed at my feet. When I picked it up, the last page bore no music, only a single line of handwriting. "You witnessed. The house remembers. You may go. I left the opera house at dawn." The door closed behind me without lock or protest. The city outside was unchanged. Buses sighing, pigeons rehearsing their usual dissonance. The deed still sat in my pocket, heavy as obligation. But when I looked back, the Aubert Opera House stood taller, its facade cleaner, windows no longer blind but bright. For the first time in decades, the marquee lights flickered to life. Her message spelled itself letter by letter. I walked away, heart bruised but lighter, every step accompanied by the faintest echo of 5 notes, C, D, E, G, D, no longer haunting, but whole. And though I told myself I would never return, some nights, when the city is quiet and my chest feels too heavy, I swear I hear applause waiting for me in the dark.